Hi, it's Bear Gardener again. I'm back with another new player deck video. I've already done, I suspect you've seen, videos on USA starters and Japan starters. I'm going to work our way down the list. I am a cards streamer, player, content creator, member of the Cards contributor program, and I'm focusing a lot of my intentions at the moment on newer players and guides for people who are new to the game. To try and give new players the best start I possibly can. So there's lots of other content on my YouTube that you can find. You can also find me all the social media that's on your screen and in the various links down below. Find me, follow me, come along to my streams, chat with me, reach out to me on social media. All those things are very cool. I'm not going to overly do the promo thing because I have to do it because analytics and algorithms, but we're going to get to the meat of it. So what we're going to look at today is a starter deck for Germany, which is going to be solid for you to base it. Now, these starter decks, I follow the same set of rules with all of them, which is that these starter decks only use cards that you unlock by owning the game and getting your nations to level 12. So always repeat this advice. Whenever you first start this game, the first thing I recommend you do is get all of your nations to level 12. At level 12, after you can do is playing against the AI, which is how I recommend doing it. Complete the starter campaigns, play against the AI with the starter decks until you get all your nations to level 12 and give you a good idea of how the game works. Most importantly, at level 12, each nation unlocks another deck, which expands your card collection. These starter decks only use cards from the main deck, the starter deck you're given, and the decks that you get at level 12. I don't use anything else, primarily because I want these to be decks that you can just pick up and play for free. You don't need to craft anything, you don't need to invest anything in it that you worry about. You can just try the deck, play it, see how you get on with it. So let's take a look at this. So for Germany, we're going to focus on what I call a blitz deck. There are lots of different ways to look at this, but it's somewhere between an aggro and a mid-range deck in that the intent is to put your opponent under pressure using primarily interactions with tanks and blitzkrieg as a finisher. We are quite limited in Germany, so when building these decks, I've specifically started with the US-German frontline deck and the Japan-Germany aggro decks as good starter decks for players because they're solid archetypes that are very well served by the starter cards. Other archetypes for the remaining three nations aren't so perfectly well served, but are still well served enough that these decks will be able to get you to a decent level. They could probably get you to Field Marshal as you craft along the way. They might take a little bit more getting used to, and they might require just a touch more crafting. But they're good fun, and they allow you to learn different ways to play. So the intent of this deck is to deploy and use primarily infantry and tanks to push your opponent, pressure through, and position yourself very similarly to frontline in a position where you can finish your opponent by playing something like blitzkrieg and winning. We go about it slightly differently than we do in the US with the US deck because we have a different approach in cards. So we're going to start from the top and go card by card, and I'll talk about the cards as I always do in these and the value of them and how long they're going to be with us. So this is dive bombing. This will be with us for a while. This card is, for one cost, can be very good. Now, on the face of it, one cost for one damage to an enemy unit can be okay if you need to clear an enemy unit. The really powerful thing that this can do is that it sets that unit's attack to 0 until your next turn, not your opponent's next turn. So this can do multiple things. It can take a 1 health unit and destroy it. It can take a multi-health high attack unit and make it neutered for a whole turn. It can't do anything until not your opponent's next turn, but the turn after. It can also make sure that you can remove a unit by dealing damage to it without your unit taking damage in return. So this is a tool that we will use on this deck to give us good trades, to increase the value of trades so that we can take out a unit without losing a unit, because trading well in this deck is going to do well for you. I have 4 M4 Greyhounds, just like I do in the US Frontline starter deck, because this is just an incredibly strong card. It's a 1/3 Blitz tank. So on turn 2, you can get this into the front line. It's card text while in the frontline units in your support line of +1 attack. It's not, unless you're running artillery or aircraft, it's not super valuable. But what is great about this is that 3 health, or 3 defense, I should say, in this game, is difficult to quickly remove. So this can be an awkward thing for your opponent to remove from the front line, which lets you keep that front line active for you to use. We've got Panzer IIA. Basically, it's a German Greyhound. It does exactly the same thing. The only difference is instead of the 1 text, it has smokescreen, which is even less useful. Realistically, you very rarely, if ever, are going to leverage from it. It's useful. It means if you drop one of these on turn 1 and you can't get it to the front line, it can only be targeted by orders. Your opponent can't rush forward and damage it. But realistically, again, this is there to give us some pressure in the front line and presence. Red Devils. Talk about this card endlessly. This is the previous 2 cards. It is a special on steroids. It's incredibly powerful because it has all of the positive qualities of the previous ones, barring the fact that it's not a tank. So it can't deploy, move forward, and attack. It can only deploy and move forward because only tanks can move and attack in the same turn. But the kicker with this is that the text on this is much more important. The fact that it costs an extra credit for your opponent to use an order, attack this with a unit, basically do anything to this card, makes it very, very sticky. Hard for your opponent to get rid of. Great card, we'll be crafting another one. Something we probably won't be crafting any more of, but are going to use for the moment, is the 56 Jaeger Regiment. It's a 2/1, it doesn't have Blitz. We really play this because it's pincer. Now, a pincer effect is, in fact, when you deploy a pincer unit, you choose another unit that is already deployed, at which point both this unit and that unit gain the benefit of its pincer text. So in this case, if I deployed this and targeted, let's say, a Greyhound, both this and the Greyhound would reduce their operation costs from 1 to 0 until one or other of them is destroyed. It's really good. You can make use of it early on and it gives us some tempo advantages. It won't be staying with us a long time, but it's a functional card. Another card that will be staying with us for a while, 22 Infantry Regiment. It's very vanilla infantry. It doesn't have a lot of teeth, but what it does have is if you control the front line, and we intend to, at the end of your turn, draw a card. In this game, as in most card games, draw is king. We want to see our deck so that we can get to other cards that we want to play. Anything that gets us to draw more than 1 card a turn is an advantage. So this is a great card. It'll be with us for a while. Pretty much the whole length of this deck. Another card that'll be with us the whole length of this deck, Panzer 35T. Super strong card. 2 cost, 2/2 Blitz tank on the face of it. Not amazing. However, the deployment effect, if you control an infantry, reduce this card's operation cost by 1, which takes it to 0. At that point, you have a 2/2 unit that can do something every turn. It can move and attack every turn. It's great. It's a great tempo card. We will be always wanting a full set of these. We will be crafting a full set later on. We don't start with a full set. If you see that I have, like, if you notice that it says I have multiples of these, this account is a little bit further on. So I own multiples of certain cards. This deck is available only from your first 2 starter decks that are available from the 5 nations. So you should have 10 decks by the time you start building these decks, 2 from each nation. Stug 3F. We'll use this because it's got the potential for very strong value. It's not a superb card, and on the face of it, a 2/3 tank, 2 cost, 1 operation cost without Blitz is not massively appealing. It has no pressure to it. However, the fact that it deals double damage against tanks means this can be used to remove a 4 health tank, which is what we will often use it for. Otherwise, it's mostly just a body. It will go eventually. 17th Infantry is here. This gives a chance to, on deployment, give another unit +1/+1. This can just beef up one of our other units. The Stug is a pretty good example, but more often we'll be targeting, say, a Panzer 35T, or a unit that's had its op cost reduced to 0 by the Jaeger regiment to make it have more attacking teeth. It's a pressure card, and the infantry itself is as vanilla gets. And it's 2/2, doesn't do anything otherwise interesting. It's all in the deployment effect. We'll keep this for a while, but it won't stay with us forever. Panzer 3L. So this is the elite that you get from the final deck that you get for level 12 in Germany. It's an okay elite. It's playable. It's a 3 cost, 2 operation cost, 3/5 tank with blitz, which means that you really want to play it on, well, realistically turn 7, because you want to pay 3 to deploy it, then pay 2 to move forward, and then pay another 2 to attack. So it's a relatively late game unit. Does get +1 attack for each non-tank unit you control, which can add up. We do have infantry in this, which will help. But it's solid. It's not. It can be a good finisher if you're in a good position. There's no reason not to include it, because we have access to it. Blitzkrieg. Very differently, we'll very quickly want to have at least 2 of these. Friendly units, it's an order, 3 cost. Friendly units in the front line have +3 attack and operate for, or 1 less until the end of turn to a minimum of 0. The minimum of 0 isn't written on there, but it's to be aware of. You can't make your operation cost any less than 0. This wins games. This is how you finish a game out. You have 3 or 4 units on the front line. You play this. If you've got 3 units on the front line, they all have 1 operation cost, and they do a total of, say, 5 damage between them. Not an unreasonable, like 2 2s and a 1 on the attack. You play this, that 5 damage suddenly becomes 14, and you're doing it effectively with no op cost. It's an incredible card. This is the finisher that you're going to use on a regular basis. We'll be crafting another one of these when we get to the later deck. Panzer 38T. 2/3 tank, 3 cost, 1 operation cost. Pretty indifferent. However, deployment, draw a card. As I've said before, draw is king in this game. We want to be able to draw cards. It fits the bill because it's tank. Solid, does its job. M18 Hellcat. This is a great card from the US. This can be very powerful. It has blitz, which means on turn 5 you can put it on the ground, move it forward, and deal 4 damage to HQ, or 10 damage to a tank, or 8 damage rather to a tank. You could remove an 8 health tank with 1 card, which sometimes is what this will do. Otherwise, it's a good blitz card. This combined with Blitzkrieg, if you have the credits, can be late in the game, can be amazing. Comes straight out of hand, and it's an additional 7 damage with Blitzkrieg on it. It's amazing. Honestly, just Hellcat plus Blitzkrieg. If you're on turn 7, 3 to play the Hellcat, 1 to move it forward, 3 to play the Blitzkrieg, at which point it's op cost 0, doing 7 damage. 7 damage to HQ on turn 7, 1 card from hand, can be very powerful. Panzer 3F. This is a buff card. We like this because we use a lot of tanks. It's a special, it's 3/3, it has an op cost of 2, it costs 3, nothing special there. However, as long as this tank exists, your German tanks have blitz. This, by the way, includes tanks that you have in hand. So it can make all of those tanks that we've had earlier that don't have blitz feel a lot stronger. And on deployment, any other tanks that are in play gain +1/+1. Great card, we can make good use of this, especially early in the game. Speaking of buffs, the 101 Infantry Regiment. 2/5 infantry, so it's survivable, which is good because we want it to be. This is another pincer unit. This pincer effect is very strong. The unit that is pincered, and technically the 101, although how often you use that is debatable, gets +1/+1 when it attacks. Now, note, when it attacks, not after it attacks. So if you have, for example, a Panzer 35T, and attack with it as a 2/2, and it's hit by this pincer, it hits as a 3/3, which means it has 1 more defense point to survive any counter damage, and it does an additional point of damage on the attack that triggers. and it continues to scale. It's very powerful. M16 Half Track. This is a tempo play card. It's really good for positional play. On deployment, an enemy air or infantry unit must retreat. Retreat meaning either to go from the front line to the support line or from the support line back to hand. It's a very useful card. It's a utility card that we can use to get us some tempo, and as a side effect, it's tank, and if we've got the Panzer IIIF active, it has blitz. Not that that's a big deal, but it can be helpful. Flampanzer, this is another utility card. This is this is what I would call soft removal. So it's a 3/3, 2-op cost, 3-cost tank. Very vanilla. But it does have deployment. Destroy a target enemy unit with cost of 1 or less. Granted, there aren't that many units with cost 1 or less, but this can be really, really strong for removing Greyhounds, similar units in the front line. Would cost you an extra. It would cost more if you wanted to play around with the Red Devils, but you'll find that out as you go. Flampanzer is very good. Vesp. This is in here because at the moment there's no reason not to include it. It's not going to be with us for very long because we're not really focusing on heavy artillery play. But the +2 attack when you control a tank, 1 cost 3 damage when you're using the op cost on it, can be pretty good. Certainly got value. Panzer IIIJ. I mean, this is. I suppose in many ways this is a defining card for this deck in the sense that this is a very on-curve blitz tank. It's 4 cost, 2 op cost, 4/5. It's solid. It's not amazing, but it does a job. BF 1097, the Trop, as I like to call it. This is a card I think is very, very undervalued, especially at lower levels. At 4 cost, 2 op cost, 3/3, it's honestly on the face of it a terrible card. It is an aircraft, which is nice. It's a fighter, so it can't avoid guard. It'd be even better if it was a bomber, but as a fighter, it's strong. The deployment effect is the kicker with this card. +1/+1 if you control an infantry or tank, +3/+3 if you control both. So if you have an infantry and a tank on the board, in our deck we're going to quite regularly, and play this card, it becomes a 6/6 air unit. It's nothing to sniff at. It will make your opponent think and have to find an answer to it. We like that. Speaking of having to find an answer, 2nd California. Early on, this card is really, really strong. Later game, it becomes less so as opponents get access to more responses and removal and more savvy ways around cards. But early on, this can put a lot of pressure on your opponent. Because, yes, it's 5 cost, you need to play it on turn 6 because you also want to blitz it forward. It's 5 damage, it's only 3 health, but that 3 health is combat damage dealt to this unit is reduced to 1. So unless it's attacked by an order, this unit is guaranteed to make at least 3 attacks. If you can get a buff on it, 101 infantry, back earlier. Very worth looking at with this if it's a combo you can pull off. Very strong. List Regiment, it's here because it's strong enough for us to justify it at the minute. It will be leaving pretty quickly. It's okay, but I find it quite indifferent in the late game. But early game, a 5/6 body with a decent deployment effect and only 1 op cost isn't terrible. And again, if you control the front line, you can push a target enemy unit back to your opponent's hand. Make your opponent pay for a unit again. That can be good, especially if it's an expensive unit. It's going to be a very useful card to save for late game play, for when your opponent plays something really big and expensive, and you just want to push it back into the hand and make them have to pay to do it again. So that's the core deck, and the principle behind it, as I say, is to use these cards to basically play like a frontline deck or a mid-range deck. You want to control the front line and keep driving at your opponent. Shouldn't have too much difficulty doing it with this deck. Like all decks, starter decks, it can be improved, so we'll go and talk about improving this deck. I've mentioned many times before, a useful feature in this game is that you can, by the way, that we can export decks. So we can use a code that lets us share a deck. So if you look in the doohickey below, there will be an import code for the Bare Bones Blitz deck, which is the one that we've just talked about. and for the final Barebones Blitz deck, or late game Barebones Blitz deck, which is the one we're about to talk about. You can import a deck into your account even if you don't have the cards. Spoilers, I don't have all of the cards for this deck on this account. This is my second account, not my main account. It's a new player account that I've been doing a series on showing the new player experience with. But I built this on my main account and then imported the deck so that I can see it. I recommend that you do, and that you keep that deck as reference. It's fantastic. So if we go and look into this, we can see what this shows me is what I would like this deck to look like in late game. Now, things I want to say about this. As a late game deck, this is probably not quite as strong as the Japan aggro or US frontline decks that I've done previously. It's good, and it will certainly get you good play, but eventually you will find different things and tweak different things with it. It's still strong. It's still very playable. All of these decks are. I limit myself to only 4 elites at maximum in these final decks, and I will talk about crafting orders and things in a bit. So as I go down these cards, I'm going to skip the elites and come to them at the end, because they are the rarest cards to craft, and ones that you want to have the most care about. Tactics haven't changed with this deck. We're still doing the same thing. The intent remains the same, which is always my point. I want you to be able to learn these decks and the process of play to still serve you well in late game, rather than pivoting into different things, which you can very easily do. I do many videos on different deck archetypes. You can go see them in some of my other playlists. So let's have a look at where we've gone. So we've still got the Greyhounds. They're amazing. They're still doing their job. We've got 2 Red Devils now, again for the same reason. They're still working really hard. We've added an SD KFZ 222. Now, this is an interesting include. On the face of it, this is a very fragile card. It's a 1-cost, 1/1 blitz. However, when you play it, all adjacent ground units, that's tanks and infantry, have +1 attack, technically also artillery, if you're using artillery. This can be very strong for putting a buff on 2 of your frontline units, especially in combination with Blitzkrieg. It has good value, and it's cheap. But this is not a card you play early game. This is, you hold this and you want to see this late game, when you can just flip it in between 2 cards in the front line so that they both gain the bonus and then you hit with them. And you get the extra 1 point of damage from this. Bonus points if you can get Blitzkrieg on top of that. It's very powerful. Sudden Strike. Destroy a unit that costs 2 credits or less. It's a bit of light removal. It's in there to just give us some versatility. Depending on what you find as you go up, there are different orders that you might choose over this. Pummel, which is a 4-cost, suppress a unit destroyed if it has another effect, is a possibility. But this is a solid include and a relatively easy craft. 22 infantry, we've talked about this before. This is a draw engine for us. It's never going anywhere. We craft a second one of these and we just keep it. It's also great because many of these cards are used in the German allies of my previous 2 decks. There are some really strong German engine cards. Speaking of, Panzer 35T. Fundamental card, still incredible. We have 3 of them. We profit from their value. We'll skip the Heinkel. 64 Panzer Grenadier. So I've included this for credit acceleration. So this, on the face of it, this is a 2-cost, 2/3 Blitz infantry with 1 alt cost. It's okay. It's nothing special. However, we have becomes a veteran. If it starts, it's your turn. If it's still alive at the start of your next turn, this immediately becomes a veteran. Gains 1 extra attack. No one really cares. However, as soon as it becomes a veteran, you gain 2 additional credits. That can be very big. Credit cheating or credit acceleration is very powerful in this game. Resources are valuable. So this is a good driver to give us a tempo advantage, to increase our speed, to bring us over what we refer to as the resource curve, so that we can get more powerful or more units out than the natural evolving curve of resources expects us to. thus putting pressure on our opponent. M18 Hellcat, we've kept this around as a one-of, still useful, still got value. There are other things you might trade in over this, but I like it. It's still a very flexible card, and as I say, the turn 7, turn 8, dropping this, being able to move to the front line, put Blitz on it, and get an additional 7 damage, plus whatever else you've already got out. This can win and does win games. 101 infantry, we've kept one. You could end up with a second one if you wanted to, sort of depends on how much you find the value in it. There's a lot of flexibility in this deck, which is, depending on your playstyle, you may want to do it, but the buff is still solid. Blitzkrieg, always a 2-of for me. I don't play 3 because I find that at 3 I sometimes see it when I don't want to, and most games, I very rarely find a game where I need a third Blitzkrieg to win, and if I do need a third Blitzkrieg to win, that probably means I needed to play a little differently. But 2 of them is just amazing. Gives you good value finding your finisher. New edition, M10A1. So this is a US tank. It's 4.2, kind of like Hellcat. In fact, it's basically identical to the Hellcat, except it's no blitz. Instead, it has deployment. Suppress target enemy unit. A suppressed unit loses basically all of its text and defaults to its default stats. Like all of the buffs, all of the changes, everything that's made it cooler is just gone. That suppress effect can, for example, turn off a guard, which is what we often use it for in decks like this. When we want to finish a game, if our opponent has a big guard unit protecting their HQ, deploy the M10A1, target the guard loses the guard keyword, so we can just attack past it and ignore it. Very powerful card, well worth having in, craft a couple of them, profit. Panzer IIIF, I recommend crafting another one of these. As I've said previously, it's a solid card. The tank archetype benefits from this. It's good value. It just focuses on the archetype that we have. We have a lot of tanks in this deck. It's kind of the thing that we do. 38T, we've got 4 of these. Card draw is card draw is card draw. But I covered it before. It's a body on that can benefit from some of our other tank interacting buffs. It's very powerful. New edition, probably a priority craft for virtually any German including deck, as I've talked about in other videos, the 20 Panzer Grenadier. This is an incredibly powerful card, even though it doesn't look like it on the face of it. So, at face value, this is a 4-cost, 1-op cost Blitz infantry that's 3/4. It's an okay body to get into the front line, but it's not doing anything special. However, the deployment effect at a Panzer 35T, which we love to hand, and a combined arms. Now, Panzer 35T we've talked about before. It's our favourite little tank. Combined arms give a friendly tank unit +1/+1 for each unit type you control. There are 5 unit types in this game: infantry, tanks, artillery, fighters, and bombers. At minimum, on turn 8, which is when you really want to play this, you put the Panzer Grenadier down, move it to the front line, giving you a 3/4 infantry in the front line. You then deploy the Panzer 35T, which immediately triggers its deployment effect, reducing its op cost to 0 because you have an infantry, you just deployed the Panzer Grenadier. Then you put combined arms on the Panzer 35T. You have 2 unit types at minimum in play, so that Panzer 35T becomes a 4/4 Blitz tank with an op cost of 0. Which can then move forward and either hit something or hit HQ. It's very strong, because then you end up with a 3/4 and a 4/4 body in the front line for 1 card on turn 8. The value of this is hard to properly articulate. It's probably the first special stuff that I would recommend crafting. It's just utility. Another really powerful card, 5th Rangers. This is a limited US card. On the face of it, it is a terrible card. It's a 4/4 infantry. Granted, it has blitz, but oh good lord, it has an op cost of 4. So on turn 8, you could put on turn 8, you could put a 4/4 body into the front. That's terrible. The deployment effect, however, makes this, as I've mentioned before, a US Army knife. like a Swiss Army knife. Choose one. This unit has 0 operation cost, or gains +4/+4. Now, 9 times out of 10, we're going to play the first one, because 0 op cost on turn 4, putting a 4/4 body into the front line is very powerful. However, it's also really quite strong late game. If you've got the credits, putting an 8/8 body in the front line, also really strong, can make it very hard for your opponent to get that front line back if you have the credits to pay for it, and if you're credit cheating with things like the 64 Panzer Grenadier that we talked about earlier, you can get this out in different ways. It's very strong. It is very vulnerable, however, to suppress as a mechanic. I will point out, if it gets hit with suppress, it becomes what we're looking at now, only without blitz and the deployment effect. It's just a 4-cost 4/4 infantry with 4 operation cost. It's terrible, but niche issue. Still a very strong card. Highly recommend crafting 3 of them and just running them. Pummel. Now this is there as kind of an example of orders that we can look at. I mentioned this earlier. This is a different kind of effect. It has suppress, which we've talked about before, which is very strong. Also, if that unit costs 3 or less, it's outright destroyed. It can be very strong removal. It's quite pricey at 4. So your mileage may vary, and Germany has an awful lot of really interesting and usable orders. There's this, there's a bunch of other orders that you can play in Germany, which we might talk about in a bit, that could come in and out for this and Sudden Strike and other things. Germany has a very strong order and countermeasure suite, although we don't play a lot of countermeasures in this deck because it's not that style of deck. We've still got our 2 drops, because we're still deploying tanks and infantry, and a 6/6 aircraft is still a 6/6 aircraft. So let's hop back and talk about elites. So right at the top, we have Greif. Greif is an interesting elite. It is a 1-cost, 1-op cost, 1/1 elite. Ugh. Fairly unpleasant to think about, really. It's very vulnerable, doesn't do a lot. However, its text is incredibly powerful. If you can keep this alive, the fact that every other tank, whether on the board or deployed from hand, operates for 1 less, can give you so much momentum. It's just something to be aware of. The card is much more powerful than it looks, so much so that you may play this if you craft it and your opponent will just immediately blow it up. They'll go out of their way to destroy it because they know how much it can overwhelm you. It might not be the first elite I'd craft for this deck. In fact, it almost certainly wouldn't be, but it's good. And it is a very strong tank buff. Heinkel, this is another relatively cheap German elite. It's a bomber, not nothing in this deck, because it gives us then 4 unit types in this deck for the combined arms we proc from 20 Panzer Grenadier. But it also has Blitz, which means that we can play it on turn 3 and attack with it. Every time this attacks, you gain a card called Spoils of War. Spoils of War is a 2-cost card. It lets you look at the top 3 cards of your deck, draw one of them, put the other 2 at the bottom. And lets you work through your deck to find the tools you want. And as long as Heinkel's around, you can keep proccing this and have more and more of them. It lets you find the tools you need. It is a very underrated elite, and when you learn to use it well, it can be incredibly powerful. Solid craft. We still have the Panzer 3 out. We've talked about this before. The final elite that I have, there are many that I could have talked about. We'll have a look at those in a minute. Germany has some very good elites. I've included the FW-190 Jagd bomber. This is an incredibly powerful card. It's 5 cost, it doesn't have blitz, it doesn't do anything flashy, but it gives you a 5/4 aircraft, which A, can give you some attack, and B, is really strong for stopping enemy bombers, because many bombers will struggle to destroy this during combat and will be destroyed by it. Also, deployment. Send an enemy ground unit, again, infantry, tanks, or artillery, back to their opponent's hand. It has the same effect, being able to make your opponent have to replay a card and taking a big threat off the board. It can be a very useful utility card. So these are great cards. I will just clean this up. It's a good way of demonstrating, by the way, that we can search cards that we don't own and search all the cards that are in existence. There are many German elites out here. There is Nashub, which is not a bad craft, actually, because the first time you destroy an enemy unit on your turn, you gain credits. Credit cheating is really powerful. I didn't include it because it's not fully in keeping with what we do, but it can be very useful. Ones that are probably more worthy of note. So if we look at Comet, this can be a very powerful finishing card, because this card is interesting to use. It is a 6-cost, 0 operation cost Blitz fighter that's only a 4/2. However, it has text. At the end of your turn, return Comet to your hand. Unless your opponent has a countermeasure, or you choose to be hit to sacrifice this card, you can pay 4 cost and deal 6 cost and deal 4 damage forever. Can be incredibly powerful to finish out a game. If you can get used to using it well, it is a recommended craft, but it can be a finicky card to use because guards are a problem for it. Learning whether your opponent might have a countermeasure that destroys it is also an issue. So it's not in my recommended because it's a little more finicky to use. Bismarck, 10 cost, deals 7 damage to the enemy HQ. It's big, it's flashy, the sound effect is incredible, and it can just finish a game for 10. At some point, I recommend crafting this and including it, if only because it's a very powerful finisher. Leopold, this is, again, I don't recommend this as a craft because timing is so important with this, but it's another very powerful elite card. 10 cost, deployment. Send all enemy units back to their opponent's hand. Back to your opponent's hand. Incredibly powerful, especially if your opponent has a full hand. Because if you send cards back and your opponent hasn't got room for them, those cards are just destroyed. They're discarded, they're gone, you'll never see them again. This game does not have a way of getting back discarded cards, at least not very efficiently. There are a couple of weird niche cases, but generally speaking, a card's gone, it's gone. And afterwards, you've got a 6 damage artillery to just keep pinking your opponent for. Can be very good, but again, it's finicky to use. The one that many people do look at and go, well, why am I not including things like the King Tiger, the big tank? There are lots of reasons. One, it's 12 cost. It's very late game. If the game has gone that late, despite looking pretty, this thing is so niche unless you can credit cheat it out somehow. There are decks that do that. This is not one of them. That's why I don't recommend any of the big tanks. One tank you might want to consider if you want to go down that route is the Panther D. Now, it is 7 and 3 op cost, so it's still turn 7 and then... But it does have, when this unit attacks, the damage it deals is also dealt to the enemy HQ. No, when this unit attacks, it's dealing 7 damage, even if the opponent only has 1 health. Opponent go boom, HQ takes 7. This is buffed by 101 infantry. 8 damage. Boom, 8 damage. There are ways to use this card very well, but one of the reasons I don't necessarily recommend crafting is I can guarantee opponents will go out of their way to find a way to destroy this. It's a very scary card. Can be good though. There are others that you could look at depending on what you pick up, but as I say, those are the recommended ones. I did say we'd take a quick look at orders. We will, because this is something that Germany has a lot of, and there are many very, very good ones. We've talked about dive bombing earlier on. We've talked about a couple of others, but there are lots and lots of damage-dealing orders in here. Through the Breach, 1 cost, deal 1 damage to a unit, 2 damage if it's in the support line. It's not a bad include. Joint Operation, deal damage to a target unit equal to 1 plus the number of unit types you control. Because we have a multi-unit deck, this can be quite powerful. Generally speaking, when I have infantry and a tank, so 3 damage for 2, decent value, 4 damage for 2, very good value, and so on. What else have we got that is worth considering? Sudden Strike, we've talked about. Air Blitz. Looks good on paper. Including this in the deck is... it's not doing anything else. It's 3 cost for 3 damage to the target HQ. When it's good, it's good. When it's not, it's terrible. That's why I don't include it. Eagle Claws. This can be a very good include, especially early on in the game. 2 damage to all units in the enemy support line. As if you're holding the front line and your enemy has got lots of units in there and you play an Eagle Claws and then push on, that can be very powerful. So this is another one to consider. What you'll be getting from this, hopefully, is that there's a lot of flexibility here. There are plenty more, but I'm not going to talk about all of them because that's a bigger video. What we have here is a starter deck and a sort of a target to craft deck that should get you from level 12 with your nation levels and your decks unlocked into a position to be playing decent competitive decks. That's the intent of all of these videos. There will be more to come. I will be doing one for all 5 starting nations. I hope you find this useful. Please reach out in the comments, over social media, find me on Discords. I'm on several Cards Discords. Come on to one of my streams and ask questions. I'm here to try and help new players, and I want to help drive new players to enjoy what I consider to be a really fun and enjoyable card game. In the meantime, try the deck. If you enjoy it, keep playing the deck. Stay well, be good humans, and I will catch you in the next video.